A spiritual student of mine suggested recently that I might do a video on the topic of how self-inquiry deals with resistances. And it deals with them in a very clever way. You know, the resistances to inquiry or the spiritual search could be dealt with in different ways. There are ways that are sort of external to the spiritual or seemingly external to the spiritual, like working on our emotions through therapy and things like that. There are attitudinal changes, which are ideas that we use to try to sort of fight other ideas. Like, for example, we might tell ourselves everything is fate or God's will, regardless, and that therefore we should let go, right? And so that's one way of dealing with resistances. If, for example, you're trying to do self-inquiry or surrender, and the thought comes in, well, I've got to do some work, and this work is important for my career, and if I don't do it correctly, my job is going to be in danger. One way of dealing with that is to say, and it's it's not necessarily a bad way of dealing with it at all. Actually, it can be very useful to think about the philosophy behind non-duality. It's the philosophy behind it, which is not the same thing as it. It's the philosophy behind it, and say, I'm not really doing this anyway. Things are predetermined. What's going to happen is going to happen, right? And try to use that to sort of disarm the resistance. But that basically is using some variety of idea or concept to argue with the resistance. Self-inquiry has a somewhat different way of dealing with these resistances, if you can get yourself to employ self-inquiry, because if the resistance is strong enough, you won't be able to employ it, depending on what exactly is going on. But if you are able to employ self-inquiry, if you are able to slip in even for a second and bring a certain degree of awareness, then what self-inquiry does is it doesn't actually argue with the resistance directly. It doesn't say, for example, okay, if you're looking for, I don't know, money, somehow, right? It doesn't say, well, money's not important. The spiritual quest is what's important, right? It doesn't say that the world is an illusion, therefore you shouldn't care about this particular pleasure, right? Those are all attitudinal ideas. Those are all intellectual, philosophical ideas. They're not necessarily bad. They can be useful, but that's not the way that self-inquiry itself proceeds to disarm them. Self-inquiry really focuses on the simple fact that it's not a feeling, a desire, a need that is itself the problem. The problem is that you believe that it's your feeling, desire, or need. The issue is that it's your particular thought that's at issue. It's not suffering itself that's the problem. It's the fact that you identify with it. It's your suffering. So self-inquiry doesn't even say it's not your suffering. Self-inquiry merely says, okay, this thought has arisen about your job, your family, something you want to avoid, whatever it is. Well, whose thought is it? Whose thought is it? It simply asks, whose thought is it? It doesn't directly argue that you shouldn't do what this desire or fear is asking you to do. It doesn't say that it's less valuable. It doesn't say that the world is illusory. Now, these are all background attitudes that might be called in, but self-inquiry itself simply says, whose thought is it? Whose feeling is it? Whose suffering is it? On that hinges all the impact of those thoughts and feelings. There are billions of people in this world. They all have their own problems. They all have their own panoply of issues and wants and dreams and fears and hopes and problems, and for the most part, we happily ignore the inner lives of almost all of those people. It's only the inner life of so-called us, and maybe our loved ones, but even those are really filtered through our own inner life, because we believe that we are, that is, I am, connected in a special way to these thoughts and feelings, to this particular narrative. That connection is what makes the story have power. It's not the story itself, it's not the feeling itself, it's not the quote-unquote suffering itself, or the desire itself, or the fear itself. None of those are the actual issue. The issue is the sense that I am the one whose ideas and feelings and desires and story this is. And so inquiry says, well, okay, you have this issue about your spouse or your child or your career or something else. It doesn't argue that the concern is invalid, not directly. It merely asks, genuinely asks, because this is a genuine question, whose concern is it? The I, who is aware of this concern, what is that I? I have this issue that I've got to fix. I've got an illness or whatever, you know? The I. That I, who believes they have an illness. Who is that I? Who is that I? When you ask that question, it totally spins the thought on an axis. You know, you're not going directly and saying you're wrong. You're not fighting with yourself so directly. You're spinning it on a different plane by saying, okay, fine. Maybe it's so, but who thinks this thought? And so everything is redirected that way. As soon as you ask that question, of course, the answer is not forthcoming usually. And that very fact, that pause, immediately disarms the thought. And then another thought may arise to try to get you back into the old perspective. And again, of that second thought, again, we subject that to self-inquiry. Who's having the second thought? And this pulling and pushing between perspectives, right? One perspective in which what you are, the I that you are, is kind of assumed. You know, like you don't look at it. You're like, of course, I'm here, and I've got all these issues. In that perspective, all the issues take on this sort of sense of reality. They take on a sense of reality that's borrowed from the fact that you aren't examining what they oppose themselves to. That is, they are the possession of the I. You know, they depend on that polarity. If you don't look at the I part of it, then these other pieces are imbued with a sense of veracity or truth, because you're not looking at the frame. If you looked at the frame, which is, you might say, the I, then you'd immediately see there's something beyond the frame. And then you'd see that what you thought was reality is actually a picture. It's like a sketch or schematic. It's not actual reality. Because you do not look at the frame and you kind of assume it away, therefore the picture seems like it's all there is, and it becomes reality. seeing a picture as a picture is not necessarily the same as arguing with what it's saying. It may be saying what it's saying. The point is not that it's quote unquote wrong, the point is that it's a picture. Similarly, any thought or feeling you have, it's not necessarily about the fact that it's wrong, it's the fact that it's not yours in the way that you think it is. That's the issue. And therefore, it's not real in the way that it appears to be. I was telling the student about a story that Ramana Maharishi told about a family that was, I guess it was a hypothetical family, I think, that was told, their son died. And the person who brought this news to them, of course, devastated them with grief, but apparently he'd gotten the name wrong, and it was actually the son's friend who had died. And Ramana Maharishi used this as an example of how just these simple words, this tiny little mistake, could fill one family's heart with devastating grief, and the other family would be totally unaffected. Actually, a young man has died in either case, but in one case, it's that family's son, right? A possession is there, right? It's their suffering. That's why they care. And just that slight difference is all it makes between suffering and happiness. So Selfangry is always sort of pushing us to see the frame within which our assumptions, our story is contained, which is namely the frame of, it's my story. These things are occurring to me. This is my future. This is my past. These are my relationships. Me, that issue. But who is that me? It's not even about saying, oh, you shouldn't think so selfishly, or you shouldn't think in such a worldly way. It's not about berating yourself and trying to persuade yourself, or shove yourself, or coax yourself, or move yourself in some particular way that you think you should be. It's not about getting yourself to act in some other way that you should be. It's about asking with genuine curiosity, really, to whom are these thoughts actually occurring? Who is the I that's the subject of all of this so-called story? And in that process, you immediately create a kind of space, a kind of pause between you and taking the thoughts so obviously at face value. And that in turn creates the set of events, sets in motion the series of events that will culminate in seeing clearly that what you thought was the I isn't at all what it appeared to be.